Hey mushroom nerds, it's Anna McHugh. I'm spending some time with a gorgeous collection of Ramaria mushrooms. So this is a mushroom I haven't eaten before, but I'm really quite confident in my ID of Ramaria botrytis, or the pink-tipped coral mushroom. I am not so confident as to say I'm not going to go home and take some photographs and verify my ID, but this, among the coral mushrooms, is noted as one of the ones that is the easiest to identify based on a couple of key characteristics on top of the, pink tips that give this mushroom its common name. I want to back up and sort of talk about coral mushrooms generically. So most of them in our field guides are listed as, edible with a little bit of suspicion, and that some of them cause laxative effects. And the long and short is that Ramaria is a very, very difficult genus to identify, like down to species, especially when we're talking about the variety of Ramaria mushrooms that are sort of a, tan to cream to yellowy color. And they also look very much like marine coral. So they have this sort of upward branching thing going on, little clubby tips. And so, some of them don't agree with people. However, I spent a little bit of time doing some research in preparation for this video, particularly to nail down Ramaria botrytis, or the pink-tipped coral, as my ID here, but I'll talk about that more in a second. But on that site, so Forager Chef is a wonderful resource. Bergo is the fellow who maintains it. And he recently featured an article written by the great and lovely David Arora, who is a phenomenal person in the space of wild mushrooming in North America. Really has gone both deep and as wide as you could possibly imagine with studying these organisms, and also sort of our cultural misunderstandings and differences between how Americans treat wild mushrooms as edibles and other people around the world. And to that point, this article, which I do recommend that you just go ahead and go read yourself, basically notes that there really isn't much to support the notion that coral mushrooms uniquely are like laxative more than other wild edible mushrooms. So it's very common if you don't cook mushrooms thoroughly, they can cause you problems. I actually have a fairly sensitive belly, so that's one of the reasons I can I proceed into new species with a great deal of caution, because I really want to enjoy that experience all the way through, start to finish. But as far as actual poisoning events, there isn't anything that's been reported as a true poisoning with Ramaria mushrooms. And a lot of the other species that are considered common edibles, so chicken of the woods mushrooms most notably, a lot of people have negative reactions to it. But that said, it's very recognizable, and people, if it does agree with them, they like it very much. And so the point I think Arora was making is that overseas and really all around the world, these mushrooms are very, very popular edibles. You can find them in markets, and some of them are bitter, but as long as they're mild, a lot of them are just innocuous. And I think one of the issues that really differentiates how we treat our coral mushrooms in field guides versus how we treat other mushrooms that can disagree with people maybe just as much is that corals are really hard to identify to species. So what I'm holding up here is a coral mushroom, a Ramaria. I would not even dare to try to identify, except to say that, corals often come in these sort of tan and yellow sort of arrangements, and they look really a lot like marine coral insofar as they're sort of upward and vertical branching, really, really beautiful, but very hard to tell apart from one another. And so if you're writing a field guide and it's really kind of difficult to give your audience enough information from species entry to positively identify something that looks like a lot of other somethings, and that some of those somethings can give people the poops, you're probably better off just saying this can be a laxative, can cause a laxative effect. So all that to say, I'm not going to spend a lot of time like collecting and eating as many different Ramaria species as I can, but this pink tipped one has been living, well, I don't even know how long it's been living in this chanterelle patch, but I've been visiting this chanterelle patch for a very long time, and I love to observe this specific individual. So let's go through the identification features. So as I mentioned, the genus is Ramaria. Ramaria is not the only genus of mushrooms that look somewhat like coral, but they are characterized by, for the most part, growing on the ground and being fleshy. There is one that's called Ramaria stricta. It's tall and skinny, and it can grow on wood. But for the most part, if you're looking at a clubby and, you know, again, sort of pliable and fleshy coral-looking mushroom on the forest floor, it is more like you want to start in the Ramaria area. And there are a lot of other coral-looking mushrooms, and I really highly recommend even the ones that aren't fleshy. Just it's a lot of fun to poke and photograph and jiggle them. So go nuts whenever you find something that looks this unique and interesting on the forest floor. But anyway, so you have this sort of coral arrangement and these very nice little tips you can see. So this is a club fungus, and this is where the spores come from. And in the case of Ramaria botrytis, the pink-tipped coral, it's actually sort of a dingy white pale color. And so, you know, that is something that if you catch this mushroom when it's a little bit later in its development, it can be a little less pink. The thing that makes this really a distinctive species, and I'm going to show you this one right here because it's just like so characteristic of how this mushroom looks a lot less like a coral on the sea floor and a lot more like a cauliflower almost. So you have this chunky stem and these little florets almost going on. So this is another thing to note. The flesh is a little bit brittle, especially on these tips, so you want to handle carefully. But it has a nice, you know, most Ramarias have a nice sort of fleshy and thick interior. So and then finally, this has a sort of pleasant, here, I'll do the taste and spit. I don't do this very frequently. So like wild mushroom identification, sometimes flavor is an important and interesting piece of data to gather. It's not always important. But in the case of Ramaria mushrooms, the ones that are mild are the ones that people favor. And the ones that are bitter are obviously those that remain on the forest floor. So I know what this is going to taste. So it's really quite mild and a little bit on the sweet and a little bit of umami-ishness to it. But it is very, I wouldn't say neutral, but this is a mushroom that I think is going to go really well into a dish where it can take herbs and flavors without just soaking up a lot of oil. And I think that's one of the things when you're trying to find new mushrooms to add to your list, or at least when I am seeking that objective, I am usually looking for mushrooms, of course, that are recognizable to me. I love to say, okay, I've been seeing this beautiful thing for a very long time on my chanterelle hunts, and I've only photographed it before. So, you know, familiarity is wonderful, but also consistency and texture is something that I'm seeking, because a lot of mushrooms, they can be very delightful in flavor when they are just like a ball of salt and butter. And so you know, I mean, salt and butter, totally great. But I love mushrooms that have a little bit more sort of robust and firm flesh so that when I cook them, they aren't as absorbent. So anyway, I'm going to conclude by noting that the base of these mushrooms is kind of whitish in color. So Ramaria botrytis, again, pink tips, and then sort of a white clubby under, you know, base. And again, like, to compare this sort of cauliflower is how it's described in books to this more, you know, oceanic looking Ramaria, which is far more characteristic of things you would find in the genus. This, I think, is a really good example of how to recognize this mushroom. All of that said, I'm going to verify it with my friends, but I am very much looking forward to adding a new mushroom to my have already eaten and enjoyed list, because I have a feeling this is going to hit all of those marks. I hope you find a lot of mushrooms yourself. We've had some very interesting weather. We're having our first bit bit of fake fall in North Carolina. And so we're starting to see sort of the succession of species as the weather cools and as some of our summertime species go to bed for the year. Anyway, be that as it may, the pink-tipped coral mushroom, Ramaria botrytis. I just want to give you one last chance to feast your eyes on this beautiful cauliflower-looking thing and take the best of care. Let's talk again soon.